Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. My guest for this installment is Dr. Stephen Jonas, Professor Emeritus of Preventive Medicine at Stony Brook University in New York. Dr. Jonas has authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited over 35 books, and many of his articles and reviews have appeared in both academic and lay literature on health policy, health and wellness, athletics, and politics. He is a columnist for Op-Ed News and serves as a contributing writer for From the G-Man, which is this show's sister site. He is also the author of The 15% Solution, A Political History of American Fascism, 2001 to 2022. The book was originally self-published in 1996, and a third version, with a new author preface, was published in 2013 by Punto Press. Dr. Jonas's latest book is entitled Ending the Drug War, Solving the Drug Problem, which was published by Punto Press in 2016. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to the show, Dr. Jonas.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Gary.
On February 5, 2018, the Washington Post columnist Richard Cohen wrote an article entitled Trump is a Modern-Day McCarthy, part of which stated the following. From time to time, the Republican Party goes off the rails. It did so back in the McCarthy period when it either failed to stand up to the demagogic Wisconsin senator or cheered him on in the name of anti-communism. It did so just recently when it elevated Hillary Clinton from political opponent to absolute evil, and it is doing so now, attempting to purge the FBI and the Justice Department of officials who, for some reason, are restrained in their enthusiasm for President Trump. These Republicans see plots, where others only see common sense and a dedication to duty. McCarthyism was a cure for which there was no disease. Domestic communism was no threat to America by the time Joseph McCarthy joined the Senate in 1947. To meet the threat, he had to invent it. He proclaimed the State Department was rife with communists, giving precise numbers, sometimes 205, sometimes 57, sometimes 81. He was promiscuous in his accusations of treason, once blaming the entire Democratic Party. 20 years of treason, he said. Much of the GOP applauded. Much of the Democratic Party cowered. Do you agree with the aforementioned statements, Dr. Jonas?
Okay, Anti-Communism Then and Now is very, very different. I do not agree with Mr. Cohen at all. Mr. Trump is certainly an evil man. I think he is a proto-fascist. As you know, I publish regularly on a website called Op-Ed News, and my columns are reproduced on other websites. And, you know, I've talked about the fascist danger from Trump, and I'm one of the few people who uses that term who bothers to define it, going back to 2015 when I wrote my first column on it, which was entitled, Is it Hair Trump, H-A-I-R, or Hair Trump, H-E-R-R? Trump uses anti-communism, well, he doesn't really use anti-communism because there are no communist countries left anymore. He red baits, but he uses it to further his own political ends. It's part of his whole shtick, always attack, never defend, get off the subject as much as you can, get on to other subjects, have people think that you're doing something when you are really doing something very, that he tries to cover up. For example, the tax cuts for the wealthy, the court appointments, hoping to reward his supporters in the religious right with banning abortion to the extent that it could be banned, and the tremendous assault on regulation and any approach to dealing with the number one threat we now face, which is climate change. Mr. Cohen, I did not read the column. I have heard about it. I believe he used McCarthyism in what he meant by it was using red baiting simply to attack an opponent. McCarthy's red baiting and McCarthyism, as it was called back in the day, and I was a child then, but I remember it very, very well. I was very aware of what was going on.
You may have been very young at the time, but I suspect as you grew older and saw what was actually happening around you, you began to understand the situation on a much deeper level. Was that the case?
Well, yes, except that I grew up in a very left-wing household. I was born in 1936, so I was 10, 11 years old when McCarthy came on the scene. I was already, believe it or not, reading the New York Times, and I knew about McCarthy. I knew about Richard Nixon. I knew about Senator Munt, and I knew about all of the red baiters, and I also knew why they were doing it. And that's what makes, quote, McCarthyism, unquote, different. One of the things that makes McCarthyism different from the simple red baiting that Trump and the Trumpites use now. Domestic McCarthyism, that is looking for communists under the rug, under the bed, the primary goal of McCarthyism, which was practiced not only by McCarthy but by many others, mainly Republicans, but some Democrats too, was to get the general public in the United States very quickly to see the Soviet Union as the United States' principal enemy. The Soviet Union was a communist country. The Soviet Union very recently had been one of our two major allies in the war against Germany and Japan, the other one, of course, being Great Britain. The Soviet Union was critical to winning the war. The battles on the Eastern Front were the turning point in the war, of course, was the Battle of Stalingrad, when the Soviet Union finally turned back the German advance, and from there on it was retreat all the way to Berlin. So they had been our principal ally. Now, until the war, until the beginning, until Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, the Soviet Union had been seen as an enemy. The United States was one of the last countries in the world to recognize the Soviet government following the Russian Revolution in 1917. The recognition of the Soviet government in the Soviet Union did not happen until Roosevelt became president in 1933. The anti-Soviet policy, the policy of attempting to, quote, contain, to use George Kennan's term, the Soviet Union, the policy of making up that the Soviet Union which was going to be a major aggressor after World War II, a war in which the Soviet Union lost somewhere between 25 and 27 million people killed, and had major parts of their industry in the western parts of the country destroyed, that they were going to be in any position to launch any attacks westward. This was a myth, but it was a myth that was encouraged by the Western powers, principally the United States and the United Kingdom. So McCarthy's myth that there was a major, quote, communist threat in the United States from what was a very small communist party was precisely that. It was a myth, but it was a myth created in the service of U.S. foreign policy, which was absolutely anti-Soviet. They wanted to attempt to diminish the chances of successful recovery from the war. They wanted to slow down the progression of the reconstruction of the Soviet Union itself. And they certainly wanted to attempt to prevent the Soviet Union from being a beacon that communist movements in other countries around the world could look to as they attempted to have socialist revolutions in those countries. It is part of something that I've described in writing as the 75 Years' War against the Soviet Union, which began approximately the day after the Russian Revolution on November 7th, 1917, until the final collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992. So this was a major part of McCarthyism, was in the service of foreign policy. The other part of McCarthyism was an attempt to, which was successful to a major extent, was an attempt to weaken the left-wing forces in the United States. That's certainly not just the Communist Party, which was very small, and the leadership of the Communist Party was convicted of conspiring to overthrow the United States government by force and violence. The Communist 11 were convicted in 1948. It was a totally ridiculous charge because it even said in the Constitution of the Communist Party that they believed in peaceful change to socialism. So the Communist Party itself was very small, but there were major left-wing forces. On the electoral side, Henry Wallace, who had been Roosevelt's vice president from 1937 to 1945, he had been replaced by Roosevelt as his vice presidential candidate in the election of 1944 because right-wing forces within the Democratic Party felt that Wallace was much too progressive, much too left-wing, much too, in fact, pro-Soviet, and they replaced him with Harry Truman, who was a Middle Westerner and domestically still a progressive in terms of labor legislation, etc., but in foreign policy definitely anti-Soviet. And Truman went along with the very rapid anti-Soviet turn in U.S. foreign policy, which began almost immediately after the end of the war in the summer of 1945. And we won't go into the details there because we want to talk about McCarthyism. So one thing that differentiates McCarthyism from what Trump is doing is this connection to foreign policy to help the United States deal with what was seen as the threat of Soviet communism. The second thing was to attempt to weaken the left in the United States, and to weaken the left in the United States not through the use of political institutions like elections, for example, but through personal attacks on individual members of the left. And this was the development of the blacklist, of labeling people as, quote, communists, unquote, whether they were members of the Communist Party or not. And even if they were members of the Communist Party, it was a legal party. And just being a member of the Communist Party did not mean that you were a lawbreaker. And in fact, the number of people, there were thousands of people who were, quote, blacklisted, unquote, people who worked for government, people in private industry, and particularly people in the entertainment industry. Listeners to this program may or may not be familiar with the, quote, Hollywood 10, unquote, 10 Hollywood directors and writers and actors who were accused of, quote, being communists, who refused to answer questions from the House Un-American Activities and who were sent to prison for contempt of Congress. They broke no law. They simply refused to answer questions about their personal beliefs, and they wouldn't answer questions either about the beliefs of any of the other people that they knew. Not everybody who was called before HUAC did not cooperate. People like Edward G. Robinson, for example, did cooperate with the committee. But there were the Hollywood 10, and then there were many other people whose names we don't remember, and in fact I don't remember, who came before HUAC and refused to answer questions and went to prison.
If memory serves me correctly, wasn't there a publication that named all the members of the American Communist Party?
There was a publication called, called Red, I forget the name, Red Travelers or something like that, that named entertainers as communists. And people like Pete Seeger, for example, whom I knew, Earl Robinson, who was a folk singer and composer. They were blacklisted publicly. They had done nothing but be left-wingers. They could not get work. Pete Seeger is probably a name that many people, many listeners to this show know. They know him as a folk singer. Pete was blacklisted for about 10 years. It was very difficult for Pete to make a living. One of the things he did was he went to private homes of left-wingers to perform at birthday parties, and one year Pete Seeger sang at one of my birthday parties, and one year Earl Robinson, who created, among other things, Ballad for Americans, which Paul Robeson made famous, sang at another birthday party of mine.
Okay, for the benefit of the young people that may be listening to this interview, I need you to repeat what you said a few minutes ago. The people placed on this list lost their careers and jobs because of their political affiliations?
They were left-wingers, a variety of stripe of left-wingers. This was totally illegal. This had nothing to do with the law. It was an organization which appointed itself as the cop on the beat of getting left-wingers out of work, of destroying their lives. People committed suicide because they were on the list. And some of our listeners may remember a Woody Allen movie called The Front. That was about the blacklist of people in the entertainment industry. And it was about people who allowed the use of their name so that people on the blacklist could get work and could get paid without using their name. And of course, Dalton Trumbo, about whom there was a wonderful movie made a couple of years ago, was one of the people on that list. He was one of the members of the Hollywood 10. Dalton Trumbo won an Academy Award for a movie, and I forget the name of the movie, before anybody, and it was under a false name was used. It was Dalton Trumbo's Academy Award, and very few people knew that Dalton Trumbo had actually written that movie. But when it came to Spartacus, Kirk Douglas insisted that Dalton Trumbo's name be placed on the movie, and that was the beginning of the end of the Hollywood blacklist, when Kirk Douglas did that. Kirk Douglas made many wonderful movies. To my mind, that was the greatest thing that Kirk Douglas did. He was very, very significant in breaking the Hollywood blacklist.
Would you say the battle waged by Mr. Douglas was just as important as the role journalist Edward R. Murrow played during that time?
Different. Edward R. Murrow was attacking Joseph McCarthy, and that was very, very important. And there were even people within the Republican Party who eventually were attacking McCarthy. And there was the famous Army McCarthy hearings when McCarthy was asked by a very well-known attorney who was representing one of the people who wasn't a communist, by the way, and even, it was perfectly legal to be a communist. I saw it happen on television. I saw it live. Who said, have you no shame? That was really the beginning of the end of McCarthy. McCarthy was an alcoholic. That event occurred, I believe, in 1954, and by 1957, McCarthy was dead. But McCarthyism wasn't dead, and it lasted into the 1960s. There were other aspects of it. In New York State, the New York State legislature passed something called the loyalty oath. And if you were a New York State employee, you had to sign an oath that you were not a member of the Communist Party. Completely illegal, completely unconstitutional. In fact, it was eventually ruled unconstitutional. But thousands of people lost their jobs. School teachers, teachers in the public universities, many teachers at City College, what was then City College, lost their jobs. They lost their livelihoods. Some of them were able to find work in other occupations, but a lot of them had their lives ruined simply because they were left-wingers, but they felt that they could not sign such an oath. And in fact, maybe they were communists. It was perfectly legal to be a communist, but if they were members of the Communist Party or had been members of the Communist Party, they couldn't legally sign the oath. They couldn't swear that are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party. They couldn't sign a statement saying, no, they weren't. They lost their jobs. The general label to all of this, a lot of which didn't have anything directly to do with Joseph R. McCarthy, this is what came to be called McCarthyism. The going after thousands of people, ruining thousands of lives, significantly weakening the left wing in the United States. And by the way, that weakening was also aimed at the trade union movement. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1947. One of the most significant elements of the Taft-Hartley Act was that members of the Communist Party could not be in the leadership of trade unions in the United States. The most successful, the most militant organizers of the industrial trade unions, which began in the 1930s, whose campaign led to the establishment of the National Labor Relations Act of 1938, they were communists. The most effective leaders of these industrial trade unions, the steel workers, the auto workers, were communists. Taft-Hartley Act banned them from the leadership just because they were members of the Communist Party. So the trade union movement lost its most effective leadership, and one can trace the decline, and I have done it in writing, I'm not the only one who's done this, from the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. So one element was foreign policy. The second element was punishing people outside of the legal system, punishing people for holding left-wing views. The third element was the attack on the trade union movement. And the fourth element was the use of anti-communist propaganda politically. And, of course, one of the greatest practitioners of this was none other than Richard M. Nixon. He had a literally backwater position in the United States Navy during the Second World War. He was a lawyer. He went to a third-rate law school in California, and since I called it a third-rate, I won't name it. And when he came out, he didn't know what to do. He didn't belong to a political party. Some Republicans in California thought, we have a bright young man here, and he was. But Nixon was very smart. We'll make him a political candidate. He ran for Congress in 1946 in Southern California against a moderate Democrat named Jerry Voorhees. And Nixon attacked Voorhees as a communist. And Voorhees was no communist. He wasn't even a left-wing Democrat, and he didn't know what to do. He was completely taken by surprise, and he lost. Nixon was a two-term congressman, and then in 1950 he ran for the Senate against Helena Hagen Douglas, who was a pretty left-wing Democrat. Nixon red-baited her from morning till night, called her the Pink Lady, and won his seat in the Senate in 1950, and then became Eisenhower's vice president when Eisenhower was covering his right wing in 1952. But the Republican Party used red baiting throughout, the whole of the McCarthy period. They used it politically. And, of course, it's very interesting to see that now they're doing it again, led by Donald Trump. They're using it politically. What Trump is doing has nothing to do, except that he's a red baiter. Other than that, it has nothing to do with what McCarthyism, because McCarthyism and the practice of red baiting, of anti-communism at home and abroad, did major damage to the country just because of the element of labeling people as communists. What Trump is doing, in fact, is much more dangerous, because Trump and Trumpism have major elements of fascism, starting with concentration of power in the executive branch, and that's exactly what Trump is trying to do now with the national emergency, quote unquote, to take money that Congress has appropriated for one set of purposes and apply it to building his wall. That is an attempt to take power away from the Congress that is given to it by the Constitution and arrogate it to the office of the presidency. That's a major element of fascism. And so in that sense, Trump is much more dangerous.
Given the current political and racial tension in this country, what's to stop the Trump administration, or any future administration, from reestablishing the House Un-American Activities Committee and forcing American citizens to testify solely because of their political beliefs?
Nothing is to stop them from doing that. One of the things they don't have, is there is no major communist power, unless you think that China is a communist power. China is a very mixed economy, and, that's a whole other discussion. But no, there is nothing to stop them from labeling people. But the differences are that at least now they will not be able to use the label to deny people their livelihoods. They will not be able to use the label to send certain elements to prison. There is no communist power in the world against which the United States is arrayed because it is a communist power. China is a major rival, but that's not because it's a communist country that exports or would like to export revolution. China doesn't do that. China exports goods. China exports goods, and China is expanding its defensive perimeter a bit, and they're spending a lot of money in helping develop the third world, and the Belt and Road Initiative and the railroad across Central Asia, et cetera, et cetera. But that's very different from the Soviet Union attempting to export communist revolution. So it's a different situation.
Thank you very much for taking the time to be here, Dr. Jonas. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Gary. It's a pleasure.
I also thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.